The United States, even with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, spent less than 1% of GDP on infrastructure at its peak of spending. Do you know how much China spends on infrastructure?
A lot.
Almost 7% of their GDP.
They're
That's
a developed
crazy.
country, not like the United States. Well, hello there out there in podcast land, and a happy holiday season to each and every one of you out there. This is the last TLP podcast of the year. I'm your host, Rui DeShera, and we bring you the Liberal Patriot podcast every couple of weeks, where we endeavor to have the very finest in heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today, I'm very pleased to have Dustin Dino Guastella, who is the Director of Operations for Teamsters Local 623 in Philadelphia. He's also a research associate at the Center for WorkingClass Politics. He writes frequently for Jacobin, and his latest is Better Get Back to Building. Bidenomics wasn't ambitious enough, but the solution isn't just more welfare. And that is part of their gala Bye Bye Bidenism issue, which has just come out, which I recommend to you all. In addition to Dino's article, there's a ton of other good stuff, and we'll talk about that. And he also writes for Damage, which is a less well-known left-wing magazine, but one I think is very interesting. And we're going to maybe hit a couple of his articles that have been included in there, In Pursuit of the Family and the Antisocial Socialism Club. So he'll explain all about that later as we get more into the podcast. But first, Dino, tell us about Teamsters Local 623 in Philly. Who's in it? Who does it cover? And what are your responsibilities as the Director of Operations?
Sure. Our local is primarily UPS drivers, warehousemen, and drivers. We also cover school bus drivers, and we have Greyhound workers who are ticket and baggage handlers. So we're a pretty wide-ranging group, but primarily blue-collar workers. My job in the local is I always joke, I'm kind of the Girl Friday. I have one of these classic labor movement titles that sounds like I have a very specific job, but I do everything from organizing to bargaining to administrative work and representational work. So I do a wide range of things at the local. And mainly, we're trying to gear up for expanding not just our local, but expanding the Teamsters more broadly, especially with Amazon in particular.
Mm-hmm. Are you having much success with that?
No, it's going to be tough to see. There's a lot of enthusiasm, but given the legal situation of a lot of their drivers, especially who are all sort of third-party contracts and not technically employees of Amazon, misclassified employees of Amazon, as we say, it's going to be hard to see how we pull this out, but I'm very confident in the workers themselves who are enthusiastic, and I think that's the main thing is getting over that barrier and making sure people actually want to join the union. If they have the will, then we will figure out a way.
Yeah, I mean, break down, if you could, for us, the occupational distribution of the people who are in your local.
It's predominantly warehouse workers, then drivers after that at UPS, and then after that, drivers for school buses. Philadelphia contracts its school buses to private companies. So we represent one of those private companies. And we also represent Greyhound workers, not the drivers, but the ticket and baggage handlers.
Right. How many people are in it?
5,500 right now.
All right. Well, God bless you, sir, for the noble work you do. And let's talk, at least for a moment, about something you're also involved in, the Center for WorkingClass Politics, which I think more people should be aware of because you guys do great work. So tell us about the center, what it is, how it came into being, and what you guys are up to now.
Yeah, so the Center for WorkingClass Politics was founded in 2021 by a bunch of us who were enthusiastic about the Bernie Sanders campaign, starting in 2016 and then carrying through 2020. But those of us who were sort of on the labor side, on the more interested in the blue collar side of that coalition, and around 2020, when a lot of crazy stuff was happening on the progressive left, a group of us got together and basically said, we've noticed that there is a tremendous lack of real research dedicated to actually disseminating what working class attitudes are. There was a lot of speculation on the
Hmm.
part of the progressive, media ecosystem, and also on the part of the conservative propaganda, uh, network. And we wanted to figure out if there was a way for us to actually gauge working class attitudes and from an independent perspective and broadcast them. And so then we started with, I think our first report was called Common Sense Solidarity, which was an attempt at figuring out what it is that drew working class people to the kind of progressive economics that Bernie represented in the Democratic primary, and what is driving them away from the Democrats at the same time.
Hmm.
And since then, we've released three other big reports, all of which have kind of shed some light on the state of working class socio-political attitudes in ways most of the mainstream commentators don't talk about. You're familiar with this, Roy, obviously, but there's a consistent partisan, I would say, like directed thinking about the working class that says my side actually represents them all the time and in all these ways without actually any real evidence to back that up. And we've been able to kind of demonstrate, I think, through the years, what working class sociopolitical attitudes actually are and what that means for politics. One of the big things that we broke this year, right before the election, was we demonstrated that working class people really hated Kamala's democracy message. And we argued repeatedly that that democracy message in Pennsylvania, could really turn off the base she needs more than anything. Well, that turned out to be pretty prescient because it did turn off the base that she needed more than anything. And I think that more and more of our analyses are becoming, at least hopefully becoming, absorbed by the blob that is the kind of DC Democrat media world who think about these things and for a long time have been enclosed in a little bubble and not forced to grapple with them.
Yeah, blob it is. Why do you think that message became so dominant for so long as during this cycle when it clearly was? I mean, it wasn't just the work you guys did, which was great, but a lot of other data seemed to show it wasn't really popping with, especially with working class voters. So why were they so obsessed with it, and why did they stick with it for so long?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer here is basically it's the other half of, you guys argue about the shadow party and you make great points
Hmm.
about the shadow party. And I think the other side of the shadow party is the donor class, right? The donors, I think, especially when you see Kamala embracing Mark Cuban and people like this, some of the tech people, a lot of the Uber executives and lobbyists for the ride sharing companies, I think that they have a really strong influence in pushing the party's candidates away from talking about pre-distributive or redistributive economic policies.
Hmm.
And this democracy talk is really cheap for them. They love it because it's like it says nothing about what the candidate's going to do in office, but it does allow them to speak to a kind of vaguely liberal sentiment that the right is authoritarian and whatnot, and
Hmm.
hopefully it can mobilize the hardcore partisans, right? So I think it's that simple, Roy. I think basically they were leaned on to ease off the gas on the economic populist message, which many of their own people were telling them over and over again was their best message, and instead put their foot on the gas for the let's talk about nothing democracy message.
Well, wasn't part of it though that they actually did think not so much to reach working class voters, but their conception of the swing voters they thought they could get were more like Nikki Haley voters and people who were, basically educated, relatively affluent
But how could they
suburbanites who were
think
sick of
that?
Trump.
I mean, look,
Okay,
what
yeah.
what evidence was there that this was a sizable enough constituency to flip the states that they really needed? At least
Yeah,
I didn't
no,
see the evidence.
yeah, no, you're right. It was kind of insane, but I'm just trying, I don't know exactly playing the devil's advocate, but trying to get inside their head and see what they were thinking. I mean, most people, including I would say a lot of people involved in campaigns, they're not that literate about the actual occupational and economic structure of the United States and the way, the electorate as a whole and how it does break down into these different buckets. They're to some extent prisoners of their their underlying assumptions and inclinations, and even to some extent the bubble they live in, right? I mean, these are the people they talk to, they interact with, and they tend to make them loom larger in their political calculations than it really should. And I suppose that's back to the good old Center for Working Class Politics. I think that's exactly what you're trying to inform people about, both the magnitude of the working class vote and what these voters actually really think and want about the world, and how that doesn't line up too well with what Democrats have been offering. Well, let's move on to your article about Bidenism, the legacy of Bidenism. Your full title was "Better Get Back to Building. Bidenomics wasn't ambitious enough, but the solution isn't just more welfare." So tell us about that. What do you mean by that? And you actually started out the article by talking about sort of three camps of critique within the Democratic Party about, hey, this is a real drag. We lost to Trump for the second time, and what's supposed to happen? What was the problem? What do we do wrong? So you said there are basically three camps.
Yeah, and I'd like to know what you think about this, but it seems to me that there are three camps, at least bubbling up in the media. I don't know what's going on inside the actual, inside the Democratic leadership. But from what I can tell, there's the first camp, which is very loud, is saying, look, obviously it's the left. Throw the woke people out, get rid of the progressives, yada yada yada. They've trashed the election. There's definitely some truth to that, right? But that also often comes with this little caveat that they don't say quite as loud, which was, let's get back to the high growth mindset of the Clinton era, which was, of course, backed by NAFTA and the loss of a tremendous amount of manufacturing jobs. So it's a bit hypocritical for certain of those older school Clinton veterans to be talking about, get rid of the left, it's all their fault, when they were the ones pushing for the free trade, the more libertarian regulatory environment that has caused a lot of the frustration in the real economic sense that working class voters feel. Then there's the progressives who are on the defensive, and they say, no. In fact, no one cared about wokeness at all. No one cared about these left-wing appeals. It was all just inflation, right? Which is an excuse, because they do know that not only did they zealously push extremely unpopular slogans and policies, but that people, especially working class people, really didn't like those slogans and policies and reacted accordingly, I think, which was to say, screw you. We don't want to...
Fuck you, buddy.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm not signing up for that.
And then there's, I think, the third camp, which I hope is the one that eventually cuts through, which has an element of understanding, yes, the progressive left did say a lot of really crazy shit, which pissed off a lot of voters. But the centrists and the Clintonians have been neglecting this exact voting bloc for the past, 30 years or so. And so we have to actually take a little bit of each to make sense of what's going on. And that's the group that's sort of advocating for economic populism, right? They say, get rid of the woke cultural appeals, but do not get rid of the focus on the working class, and think seriously about why the working class matters and how we can appeal to them better. And that's a group that I think, the Center for Working Class Politics' research most closely informs.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that third camp, which does include, I guess people like you and me. It includes even people like David Landhart of the New York Times. I mean, there is some representation of this in and around Democratic circles, though I would not say it's the dominant interpretation at the current time. But what do we mean by that in terms of, I think we can all agree, let's put a lot of the crazier woke stuff to the side, and we can, I think we may get in a little bit later into how exactly could we do this. It's not easy. But in terms of economics, what do we mean by an economic program that would really appeal to the working class? I mean, I think let me give you an example. I think if you look at what the new chair of the Democratic Congressional Caucus says, the Progressive Congressional Caucus, it's basically, the problem is we don't talk enough about economic populism, right? And that seems to be no more complicated than just bashing the rich, bashing corporations, and saying they're going to pick your pocket while they're talking about all these hot button cultural issues. So I mean, you're saying something different, right? I mean, there's not a lot of meat on those bones if you're just talking about bashing the rich. You're talking about, as you say, better get back to building. So what do you mean by that? What's a more fully fleshed out progressive economic program?
Since basically the advent of what we call neoliberalism, right, the late 70s, early 80s, much of the left has basically pushed a redistributive program that said, hey, here's some more welfare programs. Here's some tax and transfer programs. Here's some cash advance programs. Here's ways to subsidize consumption, right? And that's been the goal.
Right.
And, here and there, that's been successful. It's allowed, it's definitely helped ordinary people in certain ways, but it definitely has not produced a majoritarian constituency. It has not created a really strong, working class base for the Democratic Party. And it's fundamentally ignored production and the development of the economy in a more equitable way, right? So what I say is, look, we know that there's an economic populist rhetoric that works, right? This is what you're talking about.
Right.
We can talk about these things. But what does it actually look like to actually try to govern in the interests economically of the working class? And my argument is, look, it means building. It means spending a lot of money on directing the economy to do a few things. One, to boost industrial jobs. Two, to rebuild our infrastructure. And three, to spend just a lot of energy and investment on fixing all of the things that are kind of crumbling across the United States. I mean, all of us know, we drive, I mean, I live in Philadelphia. You drive on the roads here, they're awful. And the schools are falling apart. The bridges are falling apart. All of this is jobs, right? And they're jobs in places where there are a lot of working class people who could use high wage jobs. Manufacturing in particular has a special way of kind of fixing sick economies, right? There's a reason that developing countries always invest heavily in manufacturing. It's because they produce really high wage jobs. And a high wage job, my argument is far better than most of the social programs the left can actually offer. And the reason why is because it actually provides productive investment and income. And these are things that working class people actually want. And so this, I think, is a better vision than simply saying, let's provide a slew of promises about all sorts of social programs that we might be able to get, whittled down versions of past in a favorable congressional environment.
Yeah, I mean, why do you think the left is so comfortable sort of focusing in that way, not so much in building and more in welfare programs? I mean, there was this very interesting paper that was done by a bunch of economists, including Suresh Naidu, on the evolution of the democratic approach to economics in the working class, going back to the 70s and forward to the present day. And they located a lot of it in I guess what we tend to shorthand as a neoliberal turn, the dominance within the Democratic Party of people who were more pro-free trade, deregulation, and just generally were not in favor of sort of a more robust, sort of almost New Deal inflected approach to economics. Do you happen to read that paper? It's pretty good if you want to take a look at it.
No, I haven't, but I'd definitely be interested.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, and I think it's totally consistent with what you're saying. But let me push you on this a little bit. How would we actually? I mean, I guess the Biden people would argue, right? Hey, we did that. We spent money on infrastructure. We spent money on chips. We spent money on this. We spent money on that. But we didn't seem to get much out of it. I mean, in terms of political credit. So what's going on with that? Is it just a question of they didn't spend it on the right things, or did they not spend enough, or was the spending not efficient, or what's your take on that?
There's a few things. One, I think there's always a political lag, right? It's, when you put money into investments like these, it does take a while for them to pay off politically. Now, there is some evidence, actually, if you look county by county, that places that really did get chips investment and infrastructure investment were much more favorable to Biden-Harris than those places that didn't, even over the period of time that happened, right? So there was some evidence that there may have been some real political impact. Why wasn't the political impact greater? Well, the obvious answer, number one, is inflation. I mean, inflation just was a huge, huge problem. And this, to me, is tied into the Democrats' inability to think about managing the economy as a social democratic party might have thought about managing the economy in, let's say, the 1950s or 60s, right? When a social democrat faced with the inflationary pressures that they were faced with, would have no trouble saying, let's look at price controls. Let's look at ways that we can genuinely influence the prices of consumer goods. That's not the way the Biden-Harris people looked at these things. And I don't completely blame them. I mean, they're coming off of 50 years of economic orthodoxy that says if you dare touch anything when it comes to prices, you're going to, blow up the whole ship. But there were ways that you could have been bolder and stronger. Now, in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I think it was great. I think there were a lot of really good things in there. And I think there were a lot of really strong lessons for Democrats on how to use the power of the purse in ways that they can get huge, huge investments out of. But the magnitude is still mind-bogglingly small. Even though people look at those numbers and they're like, oh my gosh, this is so much money. We spent so much. The United States, even with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, spent less than 1% of GDP on infrastructure at its peak of spending. Do you know how much China spends on infrastructure?
A lot.
Almost 7%.
Well,
Almost 7% of their GDP.
They're a developed
crazy.
country, not like the United States.
But look at what China is doing is not, they have an authoritarian government, they lack democratic controls, but when it comes to their economic policy, it's Keynesianism on steroids. I mean, they are just pumping money into their economy in order to build things that are socially useful and provide good high-wage jobs. I see no reason why the United States can't adopt some of these policies. We don't even need to do that much because China has to build all sorts of new stuff.
Right.
We have to spend a lot of money to revamp stuff that we already have, which means if we spent, if we doubled or tripled the bipartisan infrastructure bill, I have no doubt that the amount of high-wage jobs it would create would be a windfall for Democratic votes everywhere those jobs were invested in. And those places obviously should be place-based. And if they thought like this, they would say, you know what, we're going to invest a ton of money in Pennsylvania, a ton of money in Michigan, a ton of money in Wisconsin, and a ton of money in parts of the South. And we're going to say, hey, this is where we want to put a ton of investment in order to create good manufacturing and manual blue-collar jobs and pump up the wage differential in those areas.
Well, let me push you on this a little bit more then. You're basically talking about magnitude. You're talking about the level of spending in certain areas. One thing I always like as a slogan that I think the Democrats should adopt is it's too damn hard to build stuff in this country. So this is a less comfortable area for a lot of people on the left, but don't you think that part of the problem is regardless of the level of money involved, it actually is really hard to get stuff done in this country? It really is hard to negotiate the Byzantine bureaucracies and regulations and permits you have to get. And it's inefficient, and it means you can allocate a lot of money. A lot of it doesn't get spent very fast, and it doesn't get spent very efficiently. So is that part of the progressive program, or should it be?
Absolutely, it should be. And I think this is one area, you're right, a lot of people on the left are very uncomfortable with this, but look, who was the person that people really thought was going to be Harris's VP? Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania governor. Josh Shapiro rebuilt 95 in record time after a massive collapse of one of the largest interstate highways in the country on the East Coast. He did it in, I think it was, 45 days, something like that, something insane. How did he do it? Well, because he took an approach that very few Democrats are willing to take, which is he said, we are going to, at all costs, get this done. And that meant basically cutting through a lot of the red tape that makes it very difficult to build. But it's not just a Republican program. And I think this is where people on the left lose their minds, is they're like, oh, if you cut through environmental regulations, or if you cut through certain, red tape, that bureaucratic red tape that has long been considered a political third rail for Democrats, then you're just doing conservative economics or something like this. In Spain, it's much easier to build a subway than it is to build a subway in New York City. The reason for that is not because Spain has rabid free marketeer GOP congressmen running Spain. They just have a much better understanding of which of these bureaucratic things are actually beneficial and which are a hindrance to doing the things that they really want to do, which is provide constituents the things that they want, the infrastructure they want, the services they want. In the United States, I think the left needs to adopt the same attitude and think, look, we have to have an open mind about some of these environmental regulations are insane. Some of these, anti-corruption regulations are crazy. And ordinary people can look at them and look through all of these pages and pages and pages
of bureaucratic crap that builders need to do just to pass it, and realize this is crazy. And we should just like slash a ton of it in order to do the thing we want to do, which is to fix our roads and bridges, to build new school buildings, to build new housing, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, no, it's I agree with you. Brother Guastella, I'm 100% on board with that approach. Why is it? I mean, obviously, Josh Shapiro, is able to take it into his own hands to do something along these lines. But the resistance strikes me as still being tremendous throughout most of the Democratic Party. What is holding them back? Is it the groups? Is it almost an ideology about how important it is to have these kinds of regulations in place, that it would be a betrayal of democratic approach, progressive approach to things to do anything different? Is it being afraid of being labeled a conservative? What are the mechanics of how this doesn't seem to be taken very seriously by most people involved in the Democratic Party? I mean, it's not even a number 5 issue. It's like a number 10 issue, right? And yet, I think its importance is greater.
Easily, yeah. I think the groups, the shadow party, whatever you want to call it, these have tremendous influence in the party, and a very negative influence in the party, in my opinion. Which is to say that anytime any issue gets brought up, there's an entire slew of very well-paid lobbying organizations that basically say, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do this. And those organizations get to interpret what the will of the Democratic voters are. They basically stand in for the Democratic voters. Why? Well, because we've lost the mass civil society organizations, and most importantly, we've lost industrial unions that have the kind of power to translate the will of ordinary working people into policy. Those organizations used to be, the Democratic Party would go to the Teamsters and say, what do you think of this infrastructure bill? And the Teamsters could say, we love it, make it happen. And people in the Democratic Party, people like LBJ, would make sure it got done.
Yeah, right.
Pull every string they could to make sure it got done. Yeah. But they've lost that. And what's come in its place is a kind of revolving door of NGO, industry, politician circuit, where everybody's kind of ironically, functionally extremely conservative. No one wants to do anything to upset their own donors, their own group, and it creates a tremendous amount of stasis inside the Democratic coalition. Another big problem is the litigiousness and the sheer amount of lawyers that we have in the Democratic Party world.
Many lawyers. Way too many lawyers.
America has something like 80% of the world's lawyers live in the United States. It's just
not something you want to be number one in necessarily.
No, but that has a huge impact on the fear that certain people have of doing anything, that they might, get sued. And they will get sued. They inevitably will get sued for whatever they decide to do.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Okay, well, we've got this figured out, you and me, Dino. We'll see if it percolates down to the rest of the Democratic Party. But let's go in a more social direction here, because I was very intrigued with your 2 articles. Well, you had several in Damage, but the one that recently came out was what's it called? In Defense of the Family, or something like that.
In Pursuit
of the Family. Right. So tell us about that. What's your thesis?
I think we failed to defend it, Roy, and now we have to pursue it.
Right. So how did that happen? I mean, maybe just remind people how important the family is, because it seems like a lot of people on the left have forgotten.
Yeah, well, so this article came out of thinking a lot about, obviously some of the crazy slogans on the left. Among them, one of them that caught my eye was this Abolish the Family book that came out sometime during the 2020s madness. And shortly thereafter, there was another sociological book that basically argued that neoliberalism was a product of, establishing the dominance of the heteropatriarchal family and all this kind of stuff. I was pretty surprised by this, because if you look at any of the statistics throughout the entire period of neoliberalism, that is since the late 70s to today, families have been dissolving. Mm-hmm. I mean, the United States is one of the world leaders in single-parent households. We're one of the world leaders in divorces, and we have obviously a declining birth rate that is only sort of artificially kept up by the fact that we have a really high level of immigration. Otherwise, I think we would look very similar to many Northern European countries in terms of our birth rates. So the family is dissolving. The family is obviously falling apart. And my daughter is calling for me right as I make this point.
People doing dishes, daughters calling. It's like, hey, well, it's family, man. It's family,
Right. But my point is
Yeah.
a very simple one, Roy, which is to just say that I think family life is basically co-evolutionary with progress. So when people are doing better, when the society is better off, when people have better wages, better jobs, more stable home lives, less violence on the street, less sort of destabilizing forces in the society, they tend to choose to have families, and they choose to have large families. And that was the mid-century. And it's why we had a baby boom, which no one seems to think is, everyone seems to just think it's natural that we have this baby boom.
Right.
But it was only predicated by the fact that we had certain massive progressive gains. One, in medical science and technology and education, such that we had mothers being able to survive childbirth, children being able to survive their young babyhood, and mothers and fathers being able to live long enough to have grandkids. That's when family life really flourished. Well, that took a whole lot of progress to get to that point. So I see family life as completely co-constitutive with the arc of progress. Why are we seeing the collapse of families? Well, I think we've seen over the past 50 or 60 years the collapse of progress. And so my argument is basically, if we want to care about progress, we have to care about the family. And the family offers things that a lot of things the Scandinavian welfare state, even the very best social democrats, do not offer. Namely, babies, right? The greatest amount of investment in social welfare has not produced a baby boom, but a little family can produce children. And I think these things are important for us to understand, that we live social lives, not simply atomistic, economistic lives. Like, families are good. They're good for loneliness. They're good for friendship. They're good for having kids. They're good for companionship.
Right.
They're good for old age.
Speaking of loneliness,
I think
I think the lead anecdote in your article is about this phenomenon in Japan where a lot of people are aging completely alone. And, the really striking anecdote there is some guy was found in his apartment building. He'd been dead for 3 years and nobody had any idea. They even have a name for it, right, in Japan, don't they? This phenomenon.
Yeah. Kodu Koshu.
I mean, that should shock us all. And, that's a horrible way to end your life, but it is somewhat driven by these changes in family formation and related patterns and the sort of relationship between that, and people live longer. And, we're playing with fire here, I think, being sort of cavalier about the family, which brings up, sort of an underlying question is, if you look at the progressive left, right, I would say the level of interest in preserving and defending and pursuing the family is pretty low. I mean, it's like, oddly enough, of course, a lot of these upper middle class educated people, they actually have intact families. But it's like, if you want to be a single parent or not have any kids, or, all families are equal. We shouldn't even talk about families. That's vaguely heteronormative, patriarchal, and so on. So, I mean, how did it get to the point where something as obvious and fundamental as the family to people's happiness, to society, has essentially been denigrated? I mean, it's been shoved to the side. It's like a totally optional thing that we shouldn't even really care about if we're progressives.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's the same story with everything else. As the left lost its connection to its working class roots and lost its connection to mass organizations of ordinary blue-collar people, it became dominated by educated, highly educated, affluent, and very academic, very literate people who have very different values. And part of why they have different values is a class story in and of itself, right? What are the values that are the best way to get ahead in some of the more competitive, progressive, competitive professional fields, right? They are independence, individuality, the ability to disconnect yourself from your family and move across the country for that perfect job.
Yeah.
The ability to say, I'm going to go, put myself through the hardest law program in the country, 3,000 miles away, because that's what's going to get me the best job. The ability to cut yourself off from friends and family and all this kind of stuff. These are the professional class values that are then translated into cultural values. And so one thing that I always say, which really annoys a lot of people, is that professional class values are professional class interests.
Mm-hmm.
It's not simply that these are choices that these people have made to be liberal in these sorts of ways and liberated in these sorts of ways. They are a part of a social condition that says these are the ways in which you get ahead
Mm-hmm.
in professional class life. If those are the way you get ahead in professional class life, you are going to make them, naturalize them yourself as, in fact, good things for the society, good things for people, because they've been good for
Right,
you and for
right.
your career.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point, and I agree with it that it isn't just a matter of their viewpoints in these things. It is a matter of their interests. I mean, Musa Al-Gharbi's new book, "We Have Never Been Woke," makes that in a much broader sense. This sort of whole cluster of sort of cutting edge social and cultural views, which are then enforced on those unlucky enough to be in the proximity of these professional class people. It's much more about them and their interests than it is about their sort of noble beliefs in X, Y, and Z. They are actually benefiting in a broad sense from the diffusion of these kinds of norms and wokeness in general in and around their professions and their labor market they're part of. That so when they're pushing their shtick about a lot of these things, don't believe the hype. I mean, there's something more behind it than just their belief system. I mean, they're to some extent safeguarding their interests, and we should all be cognizant of that. And as well as as you are, and as our working class comrades should be. I think that's part of what really annoys working class people about a lot of this stuff, right? Is they feel like they're being looked down upon because they don't share all these values, and they're unenlightened people because of that, or maybe just bad people. But their gut feeling about this is these jerks are basically like pushing their own shtick, and it's in their interests, and they want me to stand up and salute, right? Well, I'm not going to stand up and salute because fuck you people. You're just, you're basically pursuing your own project, and I don't want any part of it. I don't believe in those values anyway, and so on and so forth. I mean, it is shocking when you think about it that, the dissolution of the family has affected working class people much more than the sort of upper middle class professionals, and yet the philosophy about how families don't matter and it's really not that important, and we can just throw a bunch of welfare programs at people who have, dysfunctional families or it doesn't compute, right? I mean, the people being hurt the most by these social trends are the ones who are sort of being left behind and urged to embrace sort of non-family norms, when the people who actually do embrace family norms, at least somewhat, tend to be much more upscale and educated. I mean, does that kind of stick in your craw there, Brother Dino?
Well, I think there's a lot of contradictory things going on. On the one hand, it is true that there was a conservative attempt to basically replace state functions with family functions, right? Thatcher was
Fair enough.
the best example of this. And I think the unfortunate part of that is that, you call this the Fox News fallacy, which I think is a great term. So much of what the left does is a reaction to the reaction, right? So the reactionaries say, we don't need the state. It can all be done by the family. And then the left says, well, that means that if you're a statist, if you believe that the democratic state should have more power in the economy, you must therefore be against the family. Which, to me, that logic just does not make any sense.
Completely bonkers.
It's totally insane. But I understand the chain of thought where some people on the left have come to the assumption that, well, because the neoliberals tried to offload certain responsibilities onto the family, therefore the family is inherently
right.
a
And to offend it would
be
being conservative. It would be buying into Fox News talking points.
Exactly.
So what's the solution?
But at the same time,
what's the solution? I mean, my colleague at AEI, Nicholas Eberstadt, who's an expert on fertility patterns across the world, you can look at these trends cross-nationally and even at different levels of development, and you can see the movement away from large families and toward, in many cases, no families taking place everywhere. Right, and not even in very rich countries now. I mean, you're basically you're bailing out of like rapid family formation earlier in the economic development process than countries used to. So, I mean,
in the same way we're bailing out of manufacturing faster than we used to, right? Brazil is deindustrializing faster than the United States ever deindustrialized. Its curve was much shorter than the United States' curve ever was. Same thing in Germany right now. Germany is now deindustrializing very quickly as well. So these curves are getting shorter, and they are scary, right? I think. So one thing I'll say is, on the back of, like, totally off the cuff, I think that productive societies produce children, right? Most of our societies are not productive, and so they're not producing children. They're stagnating societies, and if they're stagnant, they're not going to be particularly productive. So that's one thing I'll say, that I think growing the society does dovetail with actually being a productive society in more ways than one, right? Stagnant societies, I think, will stagnate. Number two, I think the phones actually have technology, and the phones have a huge part to play. We've really sort of created a disaster with young people, where we've made them less and less social as individuals. But the big driver, first of all, we don't think, obviously, that the ideal situation here is that every woman is forced to have 10 kids, right? That's insane. But we think the ideal situation should be, however many kids families want, and it's way higher than what the birth rate is, should be available to them, right? And why isn't it? So I think a few reasons why are very large macroeconomic reasons. And part of it is we've delayed more and more, especially in the West, but increasingly in the global South. We've delayed more and more the idea that family life is a part of your productive life, right? We insist on more and more schooling, more and more training. We insist on a longer and longer period of non-stable work life. And
adolescence continued to 30,
right.
age 30, that's pretty, world historic terms, that's extremely unusual.
It's extremely unusual. And I think that we've made this the norm. Like, we now have a phrase for, teenagers, and that is now expanded to, people think that it's unusual to get married in your 20s. People think it's unusual to settle down. Those things have obviously a negative effect on family formation. They can't not, because there is actually a hard limit to when you can have kids, and that hard limit is going to be reached at a certain age. You can't fix that problem.
No.
So I think that fundamentally the thing that we need to confront, and the frustrating thing, I think, for conservatives, is the thing that we have to confront is the social system itself, which is to say capitalism, which is a system that is not conducive to family life. And for many conservatives, I think that's a really hard thing to swallow, considering, for the past 50 years, they've assumed that not only was it conducive to family life, but it was the only way we could have strong families. Now it seems to be the case that it is, in fact, a hold on the ability to build strong families.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, a lot of conservatives who are, obviously more pro-family make a point of it than people on the left these days. They fall back on natalism, basically. We should just talk nonstop about how people should have kids, and we should lionize that, make it more virtuous. And, there might be something to be said for that, but, I mean, it doesn't really seem very plausible that you can, increase rates of family formation and, higher rates of fertility simply by, talking about, hey, the sort of terminus of this would be the state deciding, that we're going to have a natalist regime here. We're going to reward people for having kids. We're going to denigrate people for not. I don't think that seems like a plausible way to go.
Not only that, it's
but
a
on the other
way
hand,
to have
some people would
families.
also argue, right, that, we can look at places where they do make it easier, at least in a welfarist sense, to have kids. And it doesn't seem to have that much effect.
Right.
so
Hungary
I
in
suppose,
particular.
Huh?
Hungary is a good example.
Right. Well, even the Nordic countries, I mean, their fertility rates aren't terribly high. Maybe they'd be even worse without their programs. Right. But, it doesn't, nevertheless, it seems like a hard problem to crack.
Definitely.
And I gather, if I'm understanding your approach, you just think you need a different model of capitalism, and more basically for this to work. I mean, even if we have better welfare programs, even if we talk a lot about having kids and sort of, pursue the family more assiduously, it's still not likely to work.
I mean, if you look at the curves, and I'd be interested your colleague who studies this stuff, I'd be interested to see it. But if you look at the curves, there are a couple of things that we could see that are common. One, conservative culture does not seem to do much good, right? Very patriarchal
Hmm.
countries like Korea and Hungary
Sure.
don't seem to be faring that much better.
Yeah,
Latvia is
Korea's like the
doing, yeah,
worst.
Korea is doing terribly. Latvia and Korea is very much old school, what we would understand as a patriarchal culture. Um, Latvia has a very old fashioned Orthodox Christian patriarchal culture. They are doing very terribly with this.
Hmm.
Hungary, which has offered some of the most generous benefits in the world for natalism, has only barely changed
Yeah,
the
yeah. And
scales.
they are like they're actual country where the state is like 100% in on
Yeah,
natalism. I mean,
completely.
it's official policy,
It's
right?
the official
And it
policy.
just,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
doesn't seem to be changing things that much.
so obviously, like conservative culture is not the solution here, right? If it was, then we would simply see Mexico, having massively high birth rates, Latvia having massively high birth rates, and Scandinavia having, below replacement level. But the reality
Hmm.
is, Scandinavia is a bit higher than Latvia. It's significantly higher than uh, South Korea, but it's still below replacement, right? So
Right,
across the
right.
board, there is a massive crisis. So one thing I think on the ideological side is right is that the strong welfare states make it a point to be silent about the question of natalism, which I think is a mistake.
Hmm.
They act as if family formation is kind of shameful and don't talk about it. It's a silent topic in their
Hmm.
social
Yeah, that's
democratic programs.
interesting.
They're very proud of their social democratic programs, but the goals of those social democratic programs are never to grow families or support family formation. They are simply to, if you have a family, if you so choose to have a family, we will
Right.
have
Yeah, yeah. Well,
these
we'll help you
policies,
out.
right? So I think that does need to change to the extent that the ideological stuff matters, the political appeals matter. But the larger question is, if we look at these curves, it seems to be the greater integration into global markets, the greater integration into and shock from the integration
Hmm.
into the global market, the steeper the curve downhill. So
Right.
those countries that were plunged, especially in Eastern Europe, were plunged into the global market right after the fall of the Soviet Union. Those countries have suffered the absolute worst, uh, you know, uh, baby birth rates collapse. Right.
Hmm.
Those countries that have been deeply integrated for a long time and have consistently upped their integration, Japan being the leader of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is a great example. Those countries have also seen a consistent, steady downturn. So there's something about the consistent marketization of a society that seems to me the independent variable that is pushing everything down. And there are no countries that can really claim to be independent of the world market right now. And there are very few societies that have done anything to really protect their citizens from the influence of the world market. So I think these are very big questions and they require an answer that means getting out of not just our partisan bubbles, but also out of our national understanding of politics and confronting the beast that is global capitalism, which really
Yeah,
has.
yeah. No, I agree with that. I mean, it is an unintended consequence, arguably, of globalization that we didn't see coming, and now we can see the results. And obviously, we all need to attend to this, and not just here, but in lots of other countries in the world. Um, well, let's move on to discussing. You've got this great title of this other article in Damage, the antisocial socialism club. So talk about that. You lead off with I thought a great anecdote about some progressive activists. I'm putting them in scare quotes. Who became active around the issue of a sort of sylvan area that had become overgrown and beautiful for these professional class people, and they organized against. Well, tell us, what did they organize against?
So this was the great Meadows fight. If those of your listeners who happen to live in and around Philadelphia might be familiar with this, FDR Park, which is one of the largest and nicest parks in Philadelphia, in South Philadelphia, which is where I live, was undergoing a revitalization project, which took many years to design and develop. Well, in the middle of this, COVID happens, right? And
Hmm.
the entire project gets shut down. They have to slow everything down. They have to, figure out how to deal with the crisis. Well, the Parks Department the people in their department thought, wouldn't it be a great idea for us to open up the derelict golf course just as a new section of the park for people to walk around, since, with COVID, there's not much to be doing inside, and it'd be a good little space to have. So they did this.
Hmm.
Within a very short period of time, the abandoned golf course became like a favorite of a certain class of mostly stay-at-home professionals who
Right, right.
dubbed it the Meadows. Right, it was
Oh,
overgrown
yeah,
and beautiful
yeah.
and everything, and they would walk their dogs there and have picnics, and it was beautiful. I'm not denying that. It looked very nice, and it's a little scenic oasis in the middle of the concrete wasteland that is South Philly, especially with 95 crossing over there and the big stadiums and everything. If
Hmm.
you're familiar with the area, you'll understand it's kind of beautiful to have this little nature preserve. Well, then COVID started winding down, the lockdown started winding down, and the project to engineer the park kicked up again. Well, at this time now, there was this concerted constituency that basically said, no, we don't want the park for that. We don't want soccer fields and baseball fields. We don't want new playgrounds. We want to keep this giant piece of empty, abandoned golf course for us to walk our dogs around and have picnics in. And it seemed to me, and they protested on the part of the progressive left, right? Save the Meadows was it was self-consciously a progressive movement,
Hmm.
right? It wasn't kind of homeowner populism of like, not in my backyard, we don't want people coming into this neighborhood or something like that. It was very much we're environmentalists, it was coded as very left wing.
Hmm.
And it struck me that they were attacking a massive public investment in a public park that would benefit thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of working class youth who use these parks for their sports rec leagues. And all of this kind of came together for me. I was like, wait a second. Amateur sports, one of the most pro-social activities that we still have in America, and one of the most like important, healthy social activities that we still encourage our kids to do, should be invested in 10 times more than it's invested in. And this is a huge fight over building soccer fields from the left. And
Yeah.
it really
Wow.
bothered me. So I started looking into all these kind of this type of progressive, and it turns out they're against all sorts of pro-social stuff. And there's a certain subset of them, mostly online. I think that many of them don't exist in the real world. Not surprisingly, they're sort of allergic to sociality, but
Hmm.
they protest every sort of pro-social activity. And weirdly, this pathology has really bubbled up on the left. And I think it's bubbled up on the left because the force of the Class D alignment is such that it is people who have been work from home professionals that can embrace this kind of politics. Whereas if you're somebody who has no option but to be social in your ordinary life condition, these ideas are totally insane to you. But if you're somebody who works from home, works on a laptop primarily, and doesn't really have uh, life outside of the internet, these ideas become kind of natural. You want to consume the world free of people rather than having to deal with the people who sort of pollute your.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you're not pro-social, you care less about, the effects of lockdowns, for example. You talked about that in your article. The whole question of public order and public spaces, right? I mean, if you're basically not going there anyway, maybe you don't care if, like, city streets are becoming, kind of hard to walk down, and people are afraid of
You could
crime
just
and they're
avoid it.
afraid of open air drug use. You just avoid it. I mean, because you live in a probably nicest neighborhood, you work remotely. Who needs all this social stuff? And in the context of the, sort of the basics of human society, human life, human interaction, not to mention the history of the working class movement, all of this is very, very strange, and not at all the kind of society it seems like people on the left should be advocating and and shouldn't be the lives they're living. They should be out front leading the charge for more pro-social activity, for the investments that would make that easier, for keeping public order, and just generally for making it easier for people to live life among other people.
Exactly.
And it's astounding that has gone by the board.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. And not only that, I'll say that the desire and push for pro-social organizations and associations is the lifeblood of creating something like a New Deal. We don't get that
Hmm.
without ordinary people coming together, having organizations, having associations, and debating and deliberating in small d democratic circles that basically do not exist anymore in the United States. And it's the reason we have, I think, an antisocial socialism club is because we don't have a democratic civil society. And if we did have those things, an industrial society with a democratic civic component to it, these things would be unthinkable. But these are the ideas that fill the void in an alienated, anomic, and atomistic society.
Yeah, no, it's kind of tragic, and it doesn't seem like, a sort of plausible road forward for the left to continue down that sort of atomization sort of road. So I guess the question I put to you is, I mean, all of these kinds of attitudes are, essentially associated with what you might call the Brahmin left, the domination of the progressive left and the left in general by professional class people who have a set of values and priorities and interests that aren't really consistent with a variety of things from promoting social activity to, investing in a much more productive society. Um, how do we get out of this, right? I mean, they've got the whip hand, I think you could argue at this point in the Democratic Party, which in theory is, the party of potentially the party of social democracy. But just how friggin' social democratic is the Democratic Party at this point? It seems like there's a lot of things that get in the way, and a lot of the issues we've just been talking about with family and wokeism and antisocial socialism and the sort of, I don't know, almost cavalier attitude toward the working class and its interests and its culture and its habits and its welfare. I mean, how do you get out of this? I mean, I think it's a tough one, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a period though that has a lot of potential, right? There's a lot of strange things going on that some of which can be very useful to us. Winifred, you have to be quiet. Daddy's on the phone.
Hey, put the kid on.
Here, you want to say hi? Here, come here, say hi, and then you have to be quiet, okay? Say hi.
Hello. Hello.
Just wave.
Welcome to the Liberal Patriot Podcast.
All right.
All right. First ever youth appearance on the Liberal Patriot. So you got to love that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I think that, we're in a moment of flux, right? I think a lot of people, both on the left and people who don't even think of themselves as particularly ideological, and people on the right, are rethinking these questions, right? My hope is that if you look at the Gilded Age, which we're living through a kind of neo-Gilded Age, if you look at the Gilded Age,
fair, yeah,
no one would have said to you in 1896, in the Depression of 1896, that out of this is going to come the New Deal. They would look at you and say, like, well, this is just it. We're just stuck with this, or there's going to be a communist revolution and we're going to have total socialism, right? They wouldn't say, oh, we're going to get this kind of really efficient, shockingly well-run, politically competent order that lasts for 30 years. I think it's the last thing most people would have said.
They would have given you the horse leg.
Right. Yeah. But we're kind of in a similar moment. And so my hope is that if the labor movement can organize and develop its, organizing muscles once again and rebuild some of its strength, the labor movement can again assert its intellectual integrity and say, look, we have ideas. We are a group that can think for itself and propose ideas for the society. And it turns out that because the labor movement represents ordinary working people, those ideas will benefit the majority of the society. And so my hope is, not surprisingly, Roy, in the working class itself and in the working class movement, that it's capable of flexing its muscles, of demonstrating to people that we can think for ourselves and we can propose things on our own. And the things that we can propose are actually better than and superior to those that are proposed by both the Brahmin left and the elite billionaire right, and that's what that's what I think needs to happen in the long run.
Hear, hear. Well, in the words of the immortal bard, 'tis a consummation devoutly to be wished. So, keep hope alive out there. And Dino, I want to thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. We ran a little longer than I intended, but it was great conversation. And actually, I had more questions, but I'll come at you some other time.
That sounds great, Roy, and
we'll discuss them.
I appreciate being invited, and I was glad to be here.
Yeah, no, it was fun. So I guess we'll wrap it up. If you're ever in D.C., come by AEI, and I'll take you to lunch. I mean, how often do you get to go to lunch at a conservative think tank? Probably not too often. Anyway, okay, all for now, guys. See you after the new year with Sohrab Ahmari. Well, he will be our next guest on the Liberal Patriot podcast. So bye for now.